Hello everyone, welcome to my studio. This series is meant to help you learn the business of jewelry. My name is Melanie Klein, and I feel very blessed to have spent my lifetime in this field. I've always had a retail store as part of my workshop, and I've learned the ins and outs of production, pricing, and marketing the jewelry that I create at my bench. This series of videos will be presented to you in 4 sections. Section 1 will help you develop your skills as a craftsman. Section 2 will be about the design, construction, production, and pricing of a jewelry collection. Section 3 will be about marketing your production line, identifying the marketplaces to sell your new line. Section 4 will be all about selling, some tricks of the trade to close the sale. It's important for you to know that many amazing metalsmiths through the ages have paved the way for you to achieve success as an artist and a craftsman. They have established an industry that's well respected and have created a marketplace where you can successfully sell your work. We will talk about design, production, pricing, and marketing, but first and foremost, we will focus on fine craftsmanship and the mastery of technique, because that is the basis of everything. Today you're going to learn some new tools and some soldering techniques that I haven't shown you before. And we're going to do it while making a feather. And our feathers are different. They're 2-sided feathers, which will expand the opportunity for how you can use them. It's nice to have them be 2-sided if you're making earrings or that kind of thing. But my goal is to teach you the process. So we're going to start today using our dividers to establish the width of the strip that we're going to cut to become the strip that we're going to use to make a feather. I have this cutter that I like very much. I just got it at the hardware store, but you'll see me use it a lot. And when I don't want to saw something, and I don't have to saw something, I'll go to this cutter as a resource. This cutter does curl the metal, and sometimes that's a good thing, and in future projects you'll see that. But this time we need this feather to be flat. So the next thing that we're going to do is put it on our steel plate, and with our rawhide mallet we're going to flatten this back out. It's important that it be nice and flat. The next thing we're going to do is use some half-round wire. This is 14 gauge half-round. That means that it's flat on one side and round on the other side. And this piece of wire is going to become the quill of our feather. So leave a little extra at the end when you're measuring the length of the quill so that you can have a lifelike looking feather. After we've established the length, using our round nose pliers, just curve the end of the half-round wire around and nip off the part that you don't need anymore with your flush cutters. Now we have a kind of a long loop. We're going to bring those 2 legs of that loop together, but not at the top. The curl at the top will become the bail of the feather. After you close up the two legs, insert and check for fit. Now using 22 gauge round wire, dead soft, we're going to make a coil. You can make little rings that are all the same size by using a tapered round nose pliers. You just have to learn the technique. Find the place on your round nose pliers that would make the size of the jump ring or the coil that it is you want to end up with. Start there and begin to wind your wire around that spot, making sure that the wire that you're feeding in is always in that spot and it's below the little circles that you're making. If you always put it in the same spot, as you turn your hand, you will see that the coil rises up the jaw of the pliers and makes a coil that are all the same size. If you have your wire at the skinny end of the pliers, it will make a tapered coil, and that is not what we're after. This is also the process that you can use to make jump rings of any size, depending on where you wind them on the jaw of your pliers. Now check your fit again, and if you like it, we'll get ready to solder it on. We're going to talk about soldering here for a minute. I know we've covered this in episode 1, but the first rule, absolutely, is that it has to be clean. If you want your solder to flow, it can't have any grease or grime or oil or lotion or liquid of any kind on the surface of the metal, or the solder won't run. So we're using a file, cleaning the inside now because it's the best time to be able to get to it. Once that coil is soldered on, it'll be a little bit harder to open those legs up and get inside. And now we're cleaning the outside where the coil is going to be placed and soldered to the half-round wire. Check again for a final fit. Remember, it has to fit tight in order for the solder to flow. And if you like it, we'll move on to soldering the piece. Here's a good close-up look at the fit. Flux the piece. That is Floron, sometimes called Banterns, sometimes called Mighty Flux. That's the kind of flux we're using. And we're using hard solder. It comes in sheets. With our solder cutter, we'll fringe the edge of it. We'll put those fringes up against our finger and cut. Having them up against your finger keeps it from flying across your bench. The next thing I always do is light my torch, and here I'm burning off the liquid on the flux so that I don't need to worry about any liquid boiling when I place my solder. We will melt one of the little squares into a ball, and as we move the torch off of it, we move the solder pick onto it, and it will be attracted to the solder pick, and we can carry it over to our piece. Now remember, the solder is attracted to the heat. I want you to learn to use the torch in your less dominant hand. So if you're right-handed, please start using your torch in your left hand. It leaves your dominant hand free to handle other tools, in this case, a solder pick. After the soldering process is finished, we dip the piece in pickle, which is a synthetic sulfuric acid, then into water. At this point, if the coil has opened up a little bit under the heat, we would close it up with our pliers. Next, we taper the ends of the quill, and I'm using a hand sander here. which I really like. It attaches to my flex shaft. But you could also do this with a file or other tools, some sort of a sander on your flex shaft. We want it to have a nice taper to die into the feather. It will look so much better. The strip that's going to become our feather is going to get soldered in next. So we have to get it nice and clean so that the solder will flow. You can use this emery cloth like I'm doing here. Or you can use the flat side of your half-round needle file. Remember that the teeth of a file cut from the top toward the handle, so use it by holding it, starting at the tip, and pushing forward. That will give you the best results. Now using your emery cloth, clean your 22 gauge strip, front and back, to get it ready for soldering. Place the quill over the strip in the position that you like, and then we're ready to solder it. Again, we're going to be using the technique of pick soldering, melting our little squares into little balls, picking it up with our soldering pick, and strategically placing them where we want the solder to spread. We start again with flux, and make sure that you flux both sides really well. And I'm holding the quill down with the cross-locking tweezers. That half-round wire for the quill is still a little bit springy, but as we heat it, it will anneal and lay down to be where it needs to be to receive the solder. I'll show you how. The main thing I want you to see is where we put the solder. Solder placement is everything. If you put it in the wrong place and you end up with a mess, it could be very difficult to clean up. So I want to teach you best solder placement techniques. And I'm going to take this little ball and I'm going to put it on top of the quill at the very end where we've tapered it. Now remember, the solder is attracted to the heat, and I want you to watch it go down the shaft. Again, we're going to take a little square of solder, we're going to turn it into a ball, and we're going to put it right at the end of that shaft. I don't know if you can tell, but I didn't put it on the feather. I put it on the shaft. Remember, the solder is attracted to the heat, which means it's going to flow to the hottest spot. I control that with my torch. You'll learn to control that with your torch. So my goal here is to heat the solder on the quill, but heat the 22 gauge sheet a little bit more to draw it down and close that seam. Watch. Now at this point, I'm going to take my solder pick and I'm going to use it as a shield I'm going to put it in front of that 22 gauge round wire that is our coil. We've left a long tail on that, and I don't want to melt that. If you need to go back and add more solder, you can put it down in the exact same spot that you put the first one. You do not need to put the solder further down the shaft. You need to use your torch to draw it there. The solder is attracted to the heat. Watch again. Hopefully you saw that. Isn't that cool? Getting a little crusty flux off of there with the tip of my file before we proceed. Here we go. Now, using our flush cutters or bevel cutters, we're going to start to add the details that turn this into a feather. Place your cutters at an angle and start to squeeze. And then move a little and squeeze again, move a little and squeeze again, making little marks in the metal. We are not cutting through. If you maintain your angle, you'll get little parallel lines. I'm speeding up the video at this point because this could be boring for you to watch my every single move. Just realize that I'm squeezing it, but I'm not cutting through anywhere. And I'm going all up the shaft, around the tip, and back down. As you can see as I do this, we're marking the front and the back at the same time. Go back around and do it again, going a little deeper this time, putting a little bit more character into your feather. See those little lines? Put a little sanded finish on it now using your 80 grit yellow radial bristle disc on your flex shaft. I find with the sanded finish it's easier to see. Just to see how it's coming along and where I might want to do a little bit more work. I decided it was a little bit longer than I wanted it to be between the end of the feather and the quill, so I cut it off. Now I'm cutting the corners off of the strip, starting to round it out. And I'm going to use my bastard file to finish the shaping. Remember again, the teeth of the file cut from the top of the file toward the handle, and that's the stroke we're going to use to put the round edges on the top of this feather. Now I'm going to use my saw with a 2/0 blade and cut some lines into the feather. I find that separating the sides into segments makes it look a little bit more realistic in the end. And I'm going to go back and use my cutter again. Because the cutter is compressing shorter sections, I'll start to get a wavy look that I like very much on the edges. Hopefully you can see those cuts. Now I'm going back in with a different cutter just for a different look. As I use this cutter, the side that I'm cutting is starting to get a little bit uneven, looking a lot more natural. I'm also going to use this cutter to work on the edges. I'm going to use my flush cutter to change the look of the feather up by the coil and make it a little bit more raggedy. Now it's starting to look more realistic to me. Now it's time to figure out what to do with the extra length that we've left from the coil. At this point, consider all your options. You're the designer. There's a good look at all the lines and ripples that the cutter put in. I apologize for being off camera when I was balling this back. But here you go, this is what the result was. Now after rinsing it and drying it, we're ready to shape the remainder of this wire from the coil. Using my forming pliers, remember those are the ones that have a flat jaw and a round jaw, I'm going to put a curve in the top near the coil, and then I'll switch to my round nose pliers for a smaller radius in my next curve coming back. I need to make sure that this wire is going to lay flat when it's time to solder it down. So using my flat pliers, I'm going to squeeze it down against the feather. It's still going to have a little spring, but I'll deal with that by annealing it over at the soldering bench. Time to clean it again to ensure the flow of solder. So use your emery cloth. Now it's time to solder down that 22 gauge wire. You're probably thinking to yourself, how is that not going to melt? I'm going to show you. Remember, you're in charge. You control the heat by moving the torch. You just have to remember where to put it. You guys, this is exactly like learning a foreign language or a musical instrument. You're not going to get it until you practice, practice, practice. It's not hard. One day you just wake up and you realize that you dreamt in French. It's the same way with metalsmithing. The more you practice, the more natural it will become, and it will go into your muscle memory. Just remember, the solder is attracted to the heat. As long as it's clean, as long as it's fluxed, you won't have any problem at all. An important thing to tell you at this point is that if you've decided to use mixed metals, maybe some parts of the feather that you're making are copper or bronze or brass, then you would switch fluxes and you would use handy flux. For some reason it's better at promoting the flow of the solder with mixed metals. Again, we're going to crustify the flux and watch the flux. Take a look at it. The condition of the flux will give you an idea of the temperature of the metal. When hard solder is ready to run, this flux gets black and spiderwebby looking. That way you don't overheat anything while you're trying to get the solder to stick. I want you to notice that I'm putting the solder on top of the 22 gauge wire. I am not placing it in a position to make contact with the feather itself. It's just on the wire, and I will use the heat to draw it to the feather and close the seam. Now watch, we're going to do it again. We're going to pick up the ball of solder with our solder pick, going to place it onto the top of the 22 gauge wire. Now I know you've seen some other videos where they're showing you how to balance the little square between the two areas that are going to make contact and create a seam. But that's not what we're doing here. If you rest one of these little squares of solder against the 22 gauge wire so that it's touching the feather, you run the risk of making a little puddle of solder that you have to clean up later. If you put the solder on top of the 22 gauge wire only and use your torch to draw it down, you won't have a mess. Watch. Now we'll pickle it, we'll rinse it, we'll dry it, and back at the bench for a final inspection and little tweaks. Sanding it now will reveal the places where I might need to do a little extra cleanup. I see a little spot here on this 22 gauge wire that needs a little cleanup work. It's right there in that curve. Can you see it? I like to use these little silicone polishing wheels. This particular one is the white coarse one. And I can just get down right in there and remove that little bit of excess solder. But the excess solder is on the top of the 22 gauge wire, so it's easy to reach. Little touch up on the quill, and we're almost there. This is a good tool to get in there and smooth out the rough spot of the top of the coil where we cut that wire in the first place. There's a few more places I'd like to tweak, so I'm going to use my flush cutters to make it a little bit more rustic here and there. There's some places near the quill that I need to clean up, but my white wheel was rounded and I don't want to cut a groove in it. So I'm going to reshape it on my bastard file. Now I have that knife edge back and I can use it in a tight spot next to the quill. This tool is like a little spinning, tapered, pointy file. It's called a Krause burr, and I use it all the time for different things. Here I just want to show you that I can make some other straight lines with it. You can use it in your flex shaft instead of a graver, but you have to maintain control. And the way we do that, whenever we use our flex shaft, is to make sure that our thumb is pushing against our other thumb. We're holding everything tight. It makes it very stable and it maintains control of the tool we're using. I'm sorry you can't see this better, but you can see how to use it, and that's the important thing. I'm feeling pretty satisfied with how this is looking. I like to fix these ends over here and make them not quite so brushy looking, put a little curve in them, a little more graceful at the top. There, I like it. The next thing that we're going to do is turn it black with liver of sulfur, and then polish with Tripoli and rouge. Here's what the silicone polishing wheels look like when they're brand new. They go on this little screw mandrel. Here's a Krause burr that I used to engrave some lines. They come like this. Here it is, all finished. Feathers are great practice because they have some tricky moves to master, and you'll get really good at technique. The fact that they're two-sided gives you more options for your designs. If you spend a day doing it, you'll end up with a little collection. And then they can be necklaces or earrings, an elaborate neck piece, or something more unusual like this hair ornament. Thank you for watching. I hope I taught you something new. Go make feathers. Go make feathers.